Harsh criticism today, one day after Wisconsin voters stood in long lines to vote in that state's Democratic primary. The long lines have stirred fears about a possible spike in the state's coronavirus cases. Former First Lady Michelle Obama tweeted that the U.S. needs to, quote, do better to ensure voting is safe for all voters. The Republican-controlled legislature refused to cancel in-person voting. Public health experts, elected officials, poll workers, and voters wanted to delay the election. The state's largest city, Milwaukee, opened just 5 of its 180 traditional polling places. Milwaukee is also home to the state's largest concentration of black voters. Thousands more stayed home, unwilling to risk their health during a statewide stay-at-home order. And joining us tonight with more on the impact of the coronavirus on the primary election process, politics, of course, is not immune to the impact of the virus, is polling expert John Couvillon. John, who is a friend to the show, we've had you on before this issue. My goodness, I don't even know where to begin with you, John. Welcome to the show. Why don't you just start by telling me what your thoughts are on things now?
Certainly. First off, thanks for having me on tonight. Where we are tonight, a lot has happened in a few short weeks. And basically, the long and short of it is this. We have, as bad as this coronavirus outbreak has been, we were actually entering a relatively slow period in the election season. And then, of course, nearly every state has either rescheduled its primaries or they're switching to 100% vote by mail. Wisconsin, unfortunately, was the notable exception to that. But going forward, what is going to happen is that the handful of contests that we have before May 12th are all vote by mail. And of course, the exception to the rule thus far, although I think it'll be changed, is Nebraska, which has a primary on May 12th. Going forward, Joe Biden, even though he is pretty much the nominee, he's still going to have to go through contests because, of course, it'll most likely still be on the ballot in most states. And you're going to have congressional races going on because even though more than half of the presidential primaries have been held, only 7 state primaries have been held. So, of course, we still have a very long election season ahead of us with that part of the election cycle.
Well, I like your optimism on this, John, but how is this all going to affect the campaign for president in November?
A lot depends on how much the severity ramps down of the coronavirus. At the very minimum, I think people are going to be reluctant to do a lot of things in person, number one. And number two, I think it puts an incredible amount of push behind vote by mail because I think people are going to be afraid to vote in person, whether it be on election day or beforehand. And given that vote by mail is an alternative, I think that those advocating 100% vote by mail systems, or at the very least removing restrictions on voting by mail, this is their year to get that legislation passed in various states.
So for African Americans, who we're hearing now are one of the hardest hit populations of this coronavirus, who already face difficulties with voting across the country, how is this going to affect the African American voting population and their numbers and their influence on American politics?
Correct. A lot of it is going to be depending on what state you're talking about, but because each of the states, they have different levels of permissiveness regarding whether you can vote by mail or not. I would suspect that there's going to be a tremendous push from Democratic groups based on what you described to push purely absentee voting by mail as opposed to showing up in person and or before election day. That's what I think is going to be the biggest change because vote by mail is something that even though currently 5 states have it for 100% of its voting, it's not something that was really being pushed heavily until now as really the only realistic alternative given what's going on.
But John, we heard the president today at the task force briefing actually talking about mail-in voting and saying that he felt that there was fraud and he wasn't a fan of it.
Correct. Now, the thing about it, though, number one, there's the irony of he and several other high ranking administration officials voted by mail. So if you're going to make those kinds of statements, of course, it's not wise to do so if you are yourself a mail in voter. Number two, you have 5 states that already have 100% mail in voting. And it seems in those states where it has occurred that elected officials there are very positive about it. The one very strong caveat is you do need ramp up time to prepare your state to switch to that type of voting. So I agree with you that that's the current word coming out of the White House. But given that it has slowly but surely been increasing in popularity, I don't think the facts necessarily bear him out.
Well, John, you've been very positive tonight, so we appreciate that. And as always, we thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.